Welcome back, everyone, to the Peer-to-Peer Policy Pod. I'm Brian Morgenstern here with the great Sam Lyman. Remember to follow us on X at MorgensternNJ at Sam Lyman33, and like and subscribe to our pod. Welcome back. Big week. We have some fresh data from the Bitcoin Voter Project about our impact on the election. We're going to talk about Trump's crypto council, Doge taking a chainsaw to federal agencies, and they found Jack the Ripper from 1888. They figured it out. They solved the mystery. Lots to get to today. Sam, where should we kick it off?
Yeah, so much to cover. You touched on the new Bitcoin voter data. Let's start there. For a quick refresher for those just tuning in, of course, Donald Trump is the president. What's so notable about his election victory last November is that he not only won the Electoral College in a crushing landslide victory, he also won the popular vote. He's the first Republican to win both the Electoral College and the popular vote since George W. Bush in 2004. So at this time, Democrats are sort of conducting their own autopsy as to where they went wrong, and Republicans are conducting an autopsy of sorts as to where they went right. And one of the gleaming areas for Republicans that went all in on Bitcoin is that Bitcoin was a real difference maker in this election. And we have brand new data that speaks to that exact point, including in the state of Pennsylvania. Can you pull up that first graphic, Dylan? Thanks. So, Brian, do you want to dig into this a little bit further? Through a lot of the data that's been uncovered recently, we've seen both in Pennsylvania and in other election races across the country, Bitcoin really did have a massive impact during the last election. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So with the Bitcoin Voter Project, we did a modeling, sort of a poll, a survey, and we were able to isolate voters that identified themselves as either owning Bitcoin or being interested in it, espousing certain values, dissatisfaction with the legacy financial system in this country, feeling maybe it doesn't work for them, so they're looking for alternatives. So we were able to sort of create this profile, this I guess android of a voter, if you will, and using those characteristics, we were able to target specific voters with digital ads and highlighting, for example, in Pennsylvania, Donald Trump and Dave McCormick's support for innovation, for fintech, for Bitcoin, for alternatives, and for empowering people to really own their own financial future. And we had identified 121,000 of those potential voters in Pennsylvania. We targeted them with advertisements, giving them information about the candidates and their positions on these issues. And the data shows that we had outperformance. We had that cohort of voters showed up to the polls at a much higher rate than they were previously modeled to show up. And so our data suggests that somewhere in the neighborhood of 18,000 voters who hadn't voted in previous elections responded to those ads and showed up to vote. The margin of victory for Senator McCormick in that state was only 16,000 votes. So I think we can credibly say that Bitcoin voters flipped a key Senate seat in the state of Pennsylvania and helped Donald Trump carry the state as well. This is monumental. We have proven the concept. This is something that we really wanted to do with this project, that Bitcoin messages, that Bitcoin values will turn out voters, will motivate voters. And we can get into the what the voting block looks like in a few minutes, but that's one really stark example. We also have data coming out of Texas where we also were active. Dylan, I think there's a tweet about that as well. Thank you. So this is, we supported Ted Cruz is a Bitcoiner himself. He mines Bitcoin. He spoke at an event that I attended, with the Texas Blockchain Council. I had the opportunity to speak with Senator Cruz there. He is truly orange pilled. He is one of the senators who not only owns Bitcoin, but mines Bitcoin as well. And based on a similar methodology, we're estimating that we turned out about 34,000 voters in the state of Texas who hadn't been voting in previous elections, but they were motivated, we believe, by our ads, the Bitcoin Voter Project ads, to show up. So again, this concept is kind of proven. There were other efforts in this election cycle Fair Shake, Stand with Crypto, Coinbase was very active. Andreessen Horowitz funded some of these projects as well. And they were not really doing what we were doing. They were identifying candidates who they thought would be supportive, and then my understanding is basically running partisan ads for and against candidates in races that they cared about, but it wasn't about Bitcoin. So what we proved is that you can talk about Bitcoin in an election and it motivates voters, and it can even swing federal office races in one direction or the other. So the gauntlet is thrown down for politicians. You can embrace Bitcoin, or the orange pilled army is just, I mean, that train is going to run right over you. So a really satisfying data set here to show that, our efforts mattered, and they set the US on a much better track for financial innovation into the future.
Yeah, Brian, I remember it was, I believe, October 2023 that you first pitched the idea of the Bitcoin Voter Project, what became the Bitcoin Voter Project. And your thesis from the very beginning was that Bitcoin has the potential to swing elections. We did the math. It showed very clearly that in 2020, the presidential election was decided by just tens of thousands of votes. And your thesis back then was that we could legitimately swing this election if we just got Bitcoiners to coalesce around a single cause and a single candidate. And it was pretty incredible to see your thesis play out in real time. We had suspicions on election day that Bitcoin really was moving the needle, but now the data actually confirms it, especially in the state of Pennsylvania, which is the swingiest of all swing states. It appears that Bitcoin really did move the needle in favor of the Republican Senate candidate, and arguably more in favor of Donald Trump as well. So it's really incredible to see that play out just according to your thesis, exactly as you laid it out. I'm curious as well, Brian, to get your thoughts on what comes next for the Bitcoin Voter Project. What role do you see it playing in the midterms in 2026? And let's zoom out even more. What role do you see it playing 5 or even 10 years down the road?
Sure. Well, first I want to share just a couple of other anecdotes that led me to believe that my thesis was correct. And, I had gone through a number of policy positions on energy, on financial services, on taxes, a number of things where the Biden administration was really on the wrong side of the Bitcoin community and where Trump could win them over. And I published that op-ed in Bitcoin Magazine, and the headline writers chose the title "Trump is the best choice for Bitcoin." Don Jr. tweeted it out. The president truthed it out. It wound up being the most read article ever on Bitcoin Magazine in its history,
Wow.
which has a substantial readership. I mean, they have 300
Huge, yeah.
or 3 million followers on social media. They are a worldwide publication, and this blew anything they had previously published out of the water. And this comes on the heels of a meeting we had with President Trump, where we talked through a number of issues, and David Bailey, the CEO of Bitcoin Magazine, mentioned, this article was the highest rated article we've ever had. And of course, Trump's response was classic. It was, "Well, welcome to ratings." He was very, very proud that a headline with
Nice.
his name in it was the most trafficked article ever in Bitcoin Magazine history. And of course, he sent out some Truth Social, some tweets about Bitcoin that wound up trending for days. So we thought that this would energize an audience, and it did. Where do we go from here? Like I mentioned, we proved the concept. So now it's looking forward. We are analyzing races for the 2026 midterms, looking at races that were decided, by less than 5 points or 4 points, 3, 2, 1. Very, very close House races, for example, and some of the open Senate seats. And we're trying to, figure out how much funding we can raise from the community and from the companies supporting it. And we're figuring out where to do that spend and where to build those lists and model those voters, because we don't want to stop here. We want to keep going. We want to keep the momentum going. We want to keep building this coalition because we think it's going to be a force for good in our electorate for a generation to come. So the next few years, we start with the next election cycle. with House races, Senate races. We'll look at state level races in certain instances, like we did this cycle. But we'll just go year by year and identify where we can play effectively and continue to grow. I think we swung a U.S. Senate seat this election. We also helped in just this data is the clearest for us that helps us to then take this to other potential donors, other potential activists, grassroots groups, and hopefully just build this coalition into a fighting force that's going to stand the test of time.
A couple groups come to mind that I think the Bitcoin Voter Project could be as influential as these groups one day. The National Rifle Association, or NRA, for example, and then Emily's List. So that's a good example of two groups on the right and the left that politicians climb over themselves to get endorsements from these groups. Do you think it's an exaggeration to suppose that maybe one day the Bitcoin Voter Project could be on a similar plane as groups like the NRA, for example?
I don't think it's a stretch at all. In fact, those are some of the exact talking points, as you know, that we were using when we were pitching this project to begin with. Was saying, look, here are some proven groups that mobilize voters that politicians have to listen to because they have such a large constituency. Emily's List or Planned Parenthood, typically supporting Democrats. The NRA is a great example. Typically supports Republicans, not always, but most of the time. And in this, I think what's interesting about it though is that in this election cycle, Republican candidates tended to be the more favorable ones, but I think that there's a bipartisan trend that we'll see where this isn't just going to be the NRA or Emily's List. This is going to be a centrist, sort of almost non-partisan coalition. It's more Republican than Democrat at this moment in time, but I don't think that's going to hold true. I think it's going to be a generational group of people who are going to be watching members' votes on both sides of the aisle and gaining more and more momentum and influence. That's my hope and what I think is going to happen. So it's cool to be in at the ground floor, and it'll be even cooler to see where this goes from here.
Yeah, you mentioned the bipartisan nature of Bitcoin holders. That was one of the most revealing facts to come out of the last election cycle, is just how diverse the Bitcoin voting bloc is as a political group. Let's look at one of these graphics that shows just how many Bitcoin holders are Republican and how many are Democrat. So if you can see here, Bitcoin Voter Project recently released this data that shows that really Bitcoiners are just as likely to be liberal, if not more likely, than they are to be conservative. And I think this is one of the biggest misconceptions among Democrats in the last election cycle. They dismissed everyone who was a quote crypto bro as being on the right. And it was one of the most short-sighted self-owns of the last election cycle. I'm curious what your take is on this, because when the Biden administration started out, it seemed like Democrats were fairly pro-crypto, in large part because SBF was, I believe, the largest donor to Biden's campaign. Of course, SBF went to jail, FTX blew up. Do you think the Democrat hard pivot to being anti-crypto was a consequence of the FTX blowup? It was their attempt to distance themselves from that? Or do you think it had more to do with Elizabeth Warren having outsized influence in the party? I'm just curious what you think was the reasoning behind Democrats' decision to go so hard against crypto in the last election cycle.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and there's a lot to unpack there. So the FTX scandal, I believe, was part of it. The Democrats were a little scarred from that. They didn't want to be seen as in the pocket of a fraudster or a group of fraudsters, and so they overcorrected. I think that is true for some Democrats. There are others on the Elizabeth Warren wing. She started out her sort of campaigning career as this populist on the side of the people, but her evolution as a politician has been really sort of on the side of big banks and this global controlling world order. And she's turned, anti-Bitcoin and pro CBDC and being able to see everyone's expenditures and control how they use their money. I mean, it's this like Orwellian uh, politician she's morphed into. Um, and I think so the combination of the FTX stink, if you will, and the Global Control Caucus, um, I think kind of led the Democratic Party astray and away from a possible populist base. Um, and so that's where they guessed wrong. And so these voters, as you saw with the data, they're all over the map, from very liberal to very conservative and anything and everything in between. So these voters were up for grabs, and these issues motivated them: the financial autonomy, empowerment, alternatives to the legacy financial system. These were messages that really did motivate the ability to innovate in America without an overbearing government slamming the brakes on new and interesting business ideas. I mean, it wasn't really partisan. I know many people who were not particularly partisan, or maybe they were on the left, tend to live on the left. Maybe they're in New York or California. And so they're just kind of in a Democrat stronghold. It's what they know. It's what they're used to. And then their government tried to put them out of business. And so, if you threaten somebody's family and their livelihood and a cause that they actually believe in, that they think they're working on to make the world better, uh, they're going to change their loyalties. Especially if their loyalties weren't that solid to begin with, since the audience tends to be younger and a little bit less calcified in their partisanship. So it was I think the combination of those factors, the scandal and the control caucus, totally misreading the moment and losing potentially a generation of voters. I think that's what we saw.
Yeah, it's interesting to consider that Bitcoin could be a moderating force in our politics or something of a uniting force. Just going back to that data that shows how many Bitcoiners are liberal and how many are conservative, and how it's fairly equal. If anything can bring people from different sides of the aisle together, it appears to be Bitcoin. And so hopefully Democrats, more of them, wake up to this. Of course, there's already a lot of forward-thinking Democrats, people like Representatives Richie Torres or Ro Khanna, who were ahead of the curve and warning their party about the danger of becoming anti-crypto. And I think those voices will be heard more and more in the Democratic Party, because it's too costly in electoral terms to ignore this voting bloc going forward. This is one of the largest voting blocs in America, and it's finally found a political voice thanks to the Bitcoin Voter Project. So a lot to unpack there, a lot to celebrate, quite frankly. The Bitcoin Voter Project made possible a completely new morning in America for the crypto industry, and President Trump was its foremost champion. And as part of his crypto agenda, President Trump, he said before he even took office that he wanted to start a crypto council. And so that has had some interesting outcomes. If you could pull up how the New York Post covered this, New York Post correctly said everyone in crypto is, quote, begging for a spot on Trump's new advisory council. And Brian, I know that you saw the outcome of this announcement and you were equally frustrated. Your take was the following. If you could pull that up, Dylan. The story makes no sense. The executive order established a working group of government agency heads. And quoting Zoolander here, I feel like I'm taking crazy pills. I felt like I was taking crazy pills too. And if that's the shot, then this is the chaser of that announcement. If you could pull that up, Dylan. So this was just released last night. Trump is having second thoughts about his crypto council. Brian, walk us through this story. What exactly happened? Why is Trump having second thoughts? Does it make sense that he's having second thoughts? And how do you view this development on our industry?
Look, there is a council. It's called the President's Working Group on crypto or digital assets. And David Sachs, the AI slash crypto czar, is leading, coordinating that body. It's gonna, instead of being an outside government advisory board, it is an inside government advisory board with agency heads like the Treasury Secretary, the SEC chair, the president's advisor, people like that. It's all enumerated in the executive order. So there was some confusion because on the campaign, the president had talked about this council with, luminaries from the industry on it. Or, he had kind of alluded to it. But then when the executive order came out, I read it, unlike that uh, reporter apparently. So I knew what it was. And it says in the order that they're going to take input from industry leaders. And so I think the direction they're going in for several reasons is to have the council of, the relevant agency heads receive information and input from the industry players regarding how we make the US dominant in this field, how we right the ship of legislation and regulation to make sure that we can really be the world leader. The United States can be the world leader in this space. That's fine. I think people were still jazzed up. A lot of people like fancy titles and like to see their name in a press release coming out of the White House or what have you. But I don't think it much matters on a practical level as to whether there's a formalized group of outside people, or if they do what the second article suggests. If you read down in the article, what it suggests is that the president's working group established by the EO will have meetings or little mini summits with different pieces of the industry. There'll be a conversation about Bitcoin mining, conversation about how exchanges operate, conversation about how, wallet providers operate. And, what are the different types of digital assets, decentralized or centralized? What's a meme coin or just kind of a collectible, like a baseball card in digital form? What is a commodity? What is a security? And they'll work this out by having, little meetings or summits with the different chunks of this industry. And I think the effect will be the same, whether there's this formal council or just the president's working group taking outside input. It doesn't really matter. We're still rowing in the same direction, which is the right direction, which is instead of driving innovative businesses offshore, we're going to help the US lead the world in financial innovation. That's the direction we're going in. And that's really the important piece. But I understand there are some, egos involved. And if you read the New York Post story, it's evident that some of the egos involved who want to see their name on a White House press release were trying to meme it into existence by kind of misleading this reporter, who again evidently didn't read the president's executive order. But if you do, it makes a lot of sense. I don't know. That's sort of your brief lesson on how we got to where we are today.
Yeah, that's a good summary of everything going on. And I think for a lot of people who aren't crypto natives, they're starting to see for the first time crypto tribalism, something that we're very familiar with, having been in this space, having worked in the space so closely for a few years. Brian, I'm curious your take on crypto tribalism in general. Do you think it's net negative for the industry? Do you think there's actually some positive consequences that come from crypto tribalism? What's your take on the tribalism that exists within the industry itself?
Some of it can be productive competition. Iron sharpens iron. And if we're heading in a direction that will be cheaper, faster, more secure payment rails, more modern stores of value, I mean, more secure blockchain technology. Okay, all of these things are good. Competition is good. What is not good are, I would say, two things. One, tearing each other down just for the sake of it because somebody has a new idea or disagrees. That's unhelpful. And the other piece is well-funded delusion. And that I would point to our frenemies over there at Ripple,
Yeah.
who are convinced that XRP, which is totally centralized, not decentralized at all, and which aspires to be the world's central bank digital currency, the ultimate, final boss of centralized assets, that they think they're somehow on par with Bitcoin, whose market cap is, I don't know how many multiples the size of it. I mean, tens or hundreds or thousands of multiples. They're not similar products, the market size is nowhere close. Um, but and the company controls like half the supply of the token. So they just, retail investors buy it, they take that money and then they're repurposing it for lobbying and advertising and all these things that, basically the self-glorification of the founders and executives. That's unhelpful. And it's bad business. And has been particularly frustrating for Bitcoiners because there's no central issuer of Bitcoin, and that's part of the beauty of Bitcoin. So I kind of look at this very unhelpful antagonism from the Ripple side as, I don't know, the Mets Yankees rivalry that I kind of grew up with. Like some New Yorkers are Mets fans and they really hate the Yankees, and the Yankees fans' response is usually, "Oh, I don't think about you at all," because they
Like the
have
Mad
27
Men
world
meme.
championships. So it's a one-way rivalry that's just totally unhelpful and muddies the water and is based on, like I said, well-funded delusion.
Yeah. Yeah. Ripple came immediately to mind for me as well. It's telling that Michael Saylor, he constantly is buying Bitcoin. That's his entire business model. His business model is buying Bitcoin, storing it, accumulating value over time. Whereas Ripple's single, it seems like their primary means of making profit, making money is selling their XRP into the market. I think that tells you everything you need to know about the differences between Bitcoin as a truly decentralized digital asset versus XRP as a much more centralized digital asset that a company uses to more or less dump on retail. So couldn't be more different, those two cryptocurrencies. And I agree with you, Brian. A lot of times XRP is not a real competitor, but it always presents itself as a gadfly. Lest we forget, it was Ripple who financed Greenpeace to attack Bitcoin on environmental grounds and to suggest that Bitcoin's code needed to be changed. And it was Ripple who also pushed along a lot of the grassroots movements, or supposedly grassroots movements in Texas. We now know with further journalistic
movements. Yeah.
AstroTurf. With further journalistic investigation, was revealed that it was Ripple behind that as well. And so I'm very grateful to see that a lot of this crypto tribalism will be sidelined. And I think all crypto participants at the end of the day, even those who are running exchanges where you're selling all sorts of meme coins, even those who believe strongly in their layer one protocol, whatever it may be, they know that at the end of the day, it's Bitcoin. Bitcoin is the granddaddy of them all. Bitcoin is the cryptocurrency, the preeminent digital asset that makes this entire ecosystem possible. Without Bitcoin, everything else would fail. At the end of the day, as the trends have shown for the past decade, just about everything goes to zero when denominated in Bitcoin. And so the US dollar is no exception. That goes for pretty much every cryptocurrency out there. And so I'm grateful that this decision I believe it will be good for Bitcoin in the long term, because deep down, everybody knows that Bitcoin is the digital asset that we should all be paying attention to. So
I always appreciate a good Keith Jackson reference, the granddaddy of them all.
yeah, I was going for the voice and everything.
I miss him.
Good man. Yeah, well, we've covered a lot of ground on crypto today. Of course, there's a lot going on in the background with Doge. So Doge is on a tear. Just in the last couple of weeks alone, Doge has effectively shut down the CFPB, USAID, and pretty soon it looks like it's going to shut down the Department of Education. And all the while, Elon Musk and his army of well-medicated autists are probably going to save the American taxpayer hundreds of millions of dollars in savings just by hundreds of millions just in DI cancellations alone, cancellations of DI programs. And so that's welcome news for a lot of taxpayers. Of course, they're uncovering a lot of the lack of transparency that exists in our government. And one of the most incredible things that they uncovered this last week was how our federal government runs its retirement program. And I kid you not, they run it in a mine. And let's pull some of the pictures of the mine that the federal government uses to process retirements. This is a mine located in Pennsylvania, an old limestone mine where 700 plus mine workers work. It's 230 feet underground, and they are able to only process 10,000 applications per month because they do it all by paper. It's all completely analog. It's 2025. why on earth is the federal government still running things this way? Brian, before we dig deeper into Doge, what's your take on the recent revelations that we've seen in the last couple of weeks alone?
It is very satisfying that the American people can now see what's going on. When I worked in the administration, a lot of people would ask, is the swamp really as bad as we think it is? And I say, no, it's not as bad as you think it is. It's way worse.
Mhm.
It is way worse. And that's what we're finding out. So much money wasted on useless programs. And there are some federal employees who are patriots and who work hard and who want to make the world better, but there are a lot of lazy ones who are just sitting there waiting for retirement. And the fact that the government's own retirement system is literally paper boxes in a mountain is so on brand for the bureaucracy. It's unbelievable. But hopefully that'll get modernized. What a concept. We can use computers now. I mean, just amazing.
Yeah, it's truly incredible. What I find even more befuddling is that Democrats have mounted such a strong response to this. Exhibit A is Maxine Waters yelling and getting in the face of some poor federal employee outside the Department of Education. Let's watch a little bit of that clip.
Look them in the eye. Come on, hold your face up. Look at him. Let him see you. This is him. Look at it. What's your name? Tell us your name. Give me that ID again.
Giving you the ID, I showed it to you.
So what?
I showed you the ID.
You do what?
I showed you the
Could
ID.
you let me see the ID again? Huh?
No.
No? Will someone else ask him for the ID? Will you ask him for it? He won't let me see it again. You didn't see it. You didn't see it. They didn't see it.
Oh my gosh. If anything shows the incompetence and the outdatedness of the Democratic Party, it's that clip right there. Maxine Waters, who herself is an octogenarian, getting in the face of some poor federal employee who just wants to remain anonymous, forcing him to show her an ID, and she has to repeat herself 3 times because she can't hear what he's saying, and then asking another old lady right next to her. It's poetic in a way. And it's also kind of sad and depressing for the Democratic Party. But Brian, I'm curious what your take is so far on the Democratic response. Why do you think they have gone so hard after this effort to cut waste, fraud, and abuse, which is itself a very bipartisan cause? Do you think that there's political juice to be squeezed from this, or do you think ultimately this effort from the Democrats will backfire against them?
I think it will backfire. I understand the strategy of create as much noise and stress and anxiety as possible so that eventually people will vote for the other side just out of pure exhaustion. I don't think it's going to work that well anymore. Having somebody like Maxine Waters, I don't think that hair color exists in nature. I don't think she should be screeching at some poor guy just doing his job. I think they really miscalculated in terms of who's going to look bad in that scenario. It's not the guy, it's them. So this reflexive, anti anything Trump does routine is played out. It kind of worked in 2020, I guess. So they're trying it again, and it's sort of what they've been doing for decades, and they don't really know what else to do. They certainly don't want to see the country unite behind Trump and have them, even more neutered. So they're grasping at straws, I think is my take. But it doesn't seem very effective because this is like, I don't know, an 80-20 issue. Like you're literally talking about like the blood relatives and paid staffers of Democrats right now are the ones supporting it, trying to, protect their own gravy train. But another reason that has been posited by Elon, and maybe there's something to this, is that all the things that they're going to expose are probably going to expose bad stuff about some of these officials. I mean, if they, were funding useless programs that their friends and family were benefiting from, which is highly likely, actually, it's going to make them look pretty bad. And it's going to make them look like, they were essentially stealing from taxpayers to fund their own lives, their own family and friends. And so, yeah, they do want to stop this in its tracks if they can, but they're just looking horrible in the process. And I think it's making them even weaker in the process. So there'll have to be a correction because it's good for the country to have two competitive political parties. Just one of them is not competitive right now at all. And it's pretty wild to see.
Right, right. And I know Elon said that they're going to investigate policymakers and members who hold elected office who make $200,000 a year, yet they have net worths of $100 million, $50 million in some cases. So they're going to look deeply into that. Interestingly enough, on Google Trends, the search term criminal defense lawyer is higher in DC for the past couple of days than it is anywhere else in the country, which I think tells you everything you need to know. In another sense, it's rational what the Democratic Party is doing in mounting such a strong opposition to Doge, because I think it reveals who their true base is, which is the deep state, the lifelong federal bureaucrats who've benefited from the bureaucratic mess that our country has become. And so it makes sense that they are reacting so virulently against any attempts to downsize what is their core constituency, their most devoted voters at the end of the day. But for the good of the country, there needs to be a downsizing here. There's a lot of good federal employees out there. And of course, we want them to stay. But there's also a lot of federal employees out there who have abused the system, and that needs exposing. There's nothing wrong with transparency. Transparency should be a purely bipartisan cause at the end of the day. You know, it's interesting as well as the Democratic Party charts a path forward. What should they do? In my opinion, they should erase everything they've done for the past 20 years and go back to their party platform from the late 1990s and early 2000s. And a perfect example of where they could be and honestly should be today is already given to them by Al Gore and Bill Clinton. The Clinton and Gore administration, they went very hard against the federal bureaucracy in the 90s, so much so that it became one of the cornerstones of their candidacy. It became something that they openly gloated about on the campaign trail and that they notched as one of their top successes while they were in the White House. Let's watch this clip of Al Gore talking about the efforts that Democrats made in the 90s to do exactly what Elon and Trump and Doge are doing today.
He gave serious consideration to totally eliminating each of these agencies. In these cases, the President and I were convinced that the reinvention and reform option was preferable. But over the next several months, we will be looking at every other agency and program, asking the direct question, do we really need this agency? Do we really need this program? Is there a better way to do it? Is there an opportunity here to give middle-class Americans a break?
Yeah, so such a different approach in messaging there between what we see from Al Gore in the 90s to what we see today. I want to pull up another clip here of a Democratic representative in Congress, Representative Garcia, talking about what he thinks of Doge and the man leading Doge. Let's play that clip.
I want to hear why, but do you think that calling Elon Musk a dick is effective messaging for confronting what is a potentially irreversible transformation of the U.S. government?
Well, he is a dick. And I think that he's also harming the American public in an enormous way. And what I think is really important.
Yeah, there we go. So for those who don't know the context of that clip, Representative Garcia in a congressional hearing yesterday said that he was going to show a dick pic, and then he proceeded to show a picture of Elon Musk. It was a joke. Of course, it was lacking in all decorum. It was lacking in all respect that should befit the
cleverness or humor either.
Right, right, which raises an interesting question. Several interesting questions, honestly. The first, Brian, I'm curious your thoughts on this is, why can't Democrats do the internet? I think what this is an earnest attempt by Democrats to be edgy and cool and interesting and troll, but it just comes off as inauthentic, and there's almost like this mean girl vibe to it, where it's not funny, it's not authentic. It, I think, diminishes them, and it makes them look bad. But Republicans are apparently really good at trolling, where Democrats, they don't seem to be able to flip it on the other side. I'm curious, first, your thoughts on that question. Why are Democrats struggling so much to resonate in the new medium that is the internet, which isn't even a new medium anymore. It's been around forever. You think they would have adjusted by now. Curious your thoughts on that front to begin.
Yeah, there's where do I begin with this? So performance art has been at the core of the Democratic Party for generations. It doesn't work anymore because the censorship industrial complex has been disbanded primarily by Elon and also by some of the actions that Trump had promised on the campaign trail, which I think he's getting into. It's very easy to just engage in faux emotive performance art based on falsehoods and snark if there's no effective pushback at all. But now there is, and they don't know what to do with it because they've never experienced this before. I mean, there are a lot of tweets I remember when kind of the Twitter regime had first turned over, where Democratic communications professionals and press secretaries really didn't know what to do because there was a whole bunch of negative messaging and stories coming out about their bosses, and they just weren't used to that. They're used to the AP being American Pravda and CNN being the communist news network, and on and on and on, where pretty much all the mainstream sources of content were on their team. And that's not the case anymore. And they haven't adjusted. The other piece is that everybody thinks they can be Trump. And everybody thinks they can troll as well as he does, that they can do insult comedy as well as he does, and they can't. I was on the finance committee for Rubio in the 2016 primaries when Rubio became Roastmaster Rubio and tried to do what Trump was doing. And it was pretty funny, but it didn't really work because it was inauthentic. It wasn't really the basis of his candidacy. It wasn't true to himself. And so I think their efforts are coming off, as you said, inauthentic. And that's why people are kind of rolling their eyes and not taking them seriously at this point.
Yeah, what you said reminds me of when I worked on a communication shop on Capitol Hill. Our communications director, he said every day, the easiest job in Washington is to be a press flack for a Democratic member of Congress because you don't have to do anything. You just let your boss do his thing, and then the press will write glowing stories about whatever your boss did that day. There's so little in the way of negative press. There's so little in the way of the press trying to uncover scandals. Whereas if you worked for a Republican member of Congress, you were besieged at all times, 24/7. Your boss was under attack. You had to be deft and quick on your feet in defending attacks from multiple different directions. Just a completely different media environment back then. And finally, Democrats are getting a taste of what it's like to exist in a media environment where your boss is actually held up to scrutiny. His actions are actually weighed by the general public. Maybe it's not by journalists from the AP or CNN, but it's certainly by independent journalists and thought leaders on Twitter and other social media. So it's refreshing and frankly more fair and democratic that the media landscape has shifted in the way that it has. I'm glad to see it. It's a welcome change. I watched the Democrats continue to fumble the ball here, and what you said, Brian, about people trying to become insult comics themselves, and that just never works because it comes off as inauthentic. Even so, a lot of Democrats are trying that right now. What do you think it will take for the Democratic Party to actually find its footing again, to actually be competitive in political races going forward? Will it take a completely new platform? Will it just take a singular leader? I'm curious what we can expect going forward because something's got to give with the Democratic Party right now. Their approval ratings, I think, are 31% by a recent Gallup poll, the lowest that it's ever been, I think, in the party's history. So yes, something's got to change. What do you think that change is, though?
A couple of things. One, I think, is a return to servant leadership and to realize that they're there to represent us, the people. And so the way I think to win an election, the way Trump won this last election is pretty stunning. He literally would go out and do these roundtables and listen to people and just listen and ask, like, what are they doing now? Do you like it? Do you not like it? What do you want done differently? And then he would come out and give a speech and say, I talked to these people and here's what I'm going to do. I mean, even with the waitress in Nevada, that's how he came up with his no tax on tips. You know, he just asked her, like, how are you doing? What do you know, what's on your mind? What are you caring about? And it was like, you know, financial stress and taxes and things like that. And so he's like, you know what? No tax on tips. Like, I mean, servant leadership is very, very important. Authenticity is very important. Not being beholden to the Global Control Caucus and Elizabeth Warren, and actually wanting to empower people and make their lives better. That's how you win election. And the authenticity piece is particularly easy to succeed at if you are doing servant leadership, if you are going out to your constituents, listening to them, hearing their requests or complaints or compliments or whatever it may be, and responding to those. Instead of starting from, I know better than you, and here's what I'm going to do, and you're going to thank me for it. Believe me, you know, it's sort of I would say an analog to it is where journalists have gone so wrong in recent years that they don't start by finding the facts and picking out the interesting ones and then reporting them. They start with the narrative that they want the conclusion to be, and then they go and nitpick or, you know, cherry pick things to support the conclusion that they want or that their editors want. I think if both Democrats and the media started to listen better and respond to what actual real people want and need, then they'll be back, you know, in pretty short order, and we'll have a more competitive political environment. But they're not there right now. They're still just knee jerk, you know, Trump is the devil, you know, Elon is a D, whatever. Like, okay. That's not persuading anyone to support you at all. So servant leadership leads to authenticity, which leads to successful election outcomes, which hopefully leads to better governance. That I think is the direction that they need to go in.
Yeah, and Brian, that exact dynamic you're describing about the media is playing out in real time with Doge right now. Very clearly, journalists are starting with the narrative and completely unconcerned with the facts. What's ironic about Doge is that Elon and his army are essentially doing what journalists should have been doing for the past decade, uncovering different instances of government fraud and abuse and waste of taxpayer money. But because they haven't done that, it requires Elon Musk to do it, essentially the journalist's job for them. And so if they could simply go to where the facts lead without a predetermined narrative, I think that'd be a huge service for the American people. And
but their response, I agree with you. He's doing them a huge favor. And their response is to say, I don't believe you. You know,
right.
Like, okay. Or you could print the stuff that he's uncovering because it would get a lot of clicks and eyeballs and you'd be pretty successful. Instead, it's just spite. The reaction is spite. And they're literally cutting off their noses to spite their face at this point.
Yeah. And the conflict makes sense given all the money that's been funneled to these media organizations by USAID. There seems to be a real conflict of interest there. And I'm sure there's only more of that to come forward, to come to light in the months ahead. So, yeah, we've covered a lot of ground today. Let's move on to round out our program with the grab bag section. I just like to hit on one of my favorite topics during the grab bag, which is the strategic Bitcoin reserve. You know, we've been talking about it for months now. Something that doesn't get enough love is how much individual states are pushing for strategic Bitcoin reserves. Texas, of course, is foremost among them. But in addition to Texas, there are 19 other states that have introduced some kind of Bitcoin reserve legislation. And there's different reports out there that show just how much demand for Bitcoin this could drive. If you could pull up that first tweet, Dylan, we see here, this is a study by Van Eck, that demand from the 20 US Bitcoin reserve bills could actually see states buying over 240,000 Bitcoin. For context, if Senator Lummis's Bitcoin reserve bill were to pass, that would see the United States purchasing about 1 million Bitcoin. And so what people shouldn't ignore with the strategic Bitcoin reserve bills on the state level is that a lot of American states have GDPs the size of major countries. Texas, again, being a perfect example. Texas has the 7th largest GDP in the world, putting it on par with countries like Italy, for example, Italy and France. So this is nothing insignificant whatsoever. Pay close attention to these strategic Bitcoin reserve bills on the state level. Of course, we're watching Texas very closely because Riot's operations are based there, and I really do think we'll get that one across the finish line. So that's just something that I found noteworthy just to end some of our programming today. But Brian, I know you have something that's way off the beaten path in terms of Bitcoin and a real good morsel from history.
Yeah, so this is not about Bitcoin. It's not about politics. This is about my guilty pleasure, which is murder mysteries, true crime. I know I'm not alone. There are millions of fans out there, and we had a huge development. They believe they've identified Jack the Ripper with DNA evidence. So can we see that tweet, Dylan, or the news story? Yeah, Jack the Ripper identified. Aaron Kosminski has been fingered as Jack the Ripper, to use the 1920s parlance. They fingered the bad guy there. Jack the Ripper, there have been numerous theories about who it was. Prince Albert was going mad from syphilis, and people thought that perhaps he was taking out, his desperation and anger on the lowly poor prostitutes of the poor section of London. Looks like it wasn't him at this point. The man they've identified was a Polish immigrant who identified his profession as a barber/surgeon. Interesting combination. And after the murders, he actually ended up being committed to an insane asylum and was treated for schizophrenia. And there were some documents that said he had homicidal tendencies. So he actually ended up living out his days in a mental institution. The way that they've identified him as probably Jack the Ripper, and he was a suspect at the time, by the way, but there was never enough evidence to arrest him. They identified him as Jack the Ripper because there was a garment, like a scarf or a shawl or something, recovered from, I believe it was the 4th Jack the Ripper murder. And that came into the possession of like a collector, historian, researcher who had done all kinds of work on the Jack the Ripper case. And so he started doing DNA testing. He wanted to identify the true Jack the Ripper. He was able to connect with the great grandniece of this Polish immigrant, of Aaron Kosminski. It was, I guess, his older brother's, I forget the connection, great grandniece in any event. His older brother's great granddaughter, I think, was the connection. So she gave a sample, and they tested that against some of the DNA recovered from that garment at the scene of the 4th murder, and they found a 100% match. So that is, I think, the strongest evidence they have to date to identify the true Jack the Ripper. And this is wild because I've watched all the movies, all the different iterations of it, where they've try to come up with tell the different stories of who people thought Jack the Ripper was, and now we know it. And I've seen some tasteless but very funny jokes about how migrant crime was a problem even in the 1880s. But it looks like it's true. It looks like that's what happened. This migrant from Poland went to London. He was about 23 or so at the time the murders were starting, and he was murdering prostitutes and carving out their organs and doing all kinds of horrible things. But now we know who it was. One of the most famous murderers ever from 1888. Here we are, all these many years later, hundreds of years later, and they figured out who Jack the Ripper was. So that's wild.
Crazy.
That's my grab bag item because I just think it's so interesting.
Yeah, absolutely wild. All I know is if I were Ted Cruz right now, I'd be quaking in my boots at how far DNA evidence has come. It's only a matter of time before they link him to being the Zodiac killer.
Well, he already claimed credit for being Jack the Ripper and Zodiac.
I didn't
So,
know that. Oh man, that's wild. Okay, that's interesting too that he was both a barber and a surgeon. I went to get my hair cut the other day, and the barber, he just knew all about the history of barbers, and apparently barbers were also surgeons back in the day, and dentists, and the people who practice bloodletting. So if you ever pass a barber shop, you'll see the pole with the red and blue stripes around it. It used to be a single white pole with just a red stripe around it, because when they would do bloodletting back in the day, to show that they were actively bloodletting, they would take a bloody towel and they would wrap it around the stripe and it would spin. So for
my.
serial killers like Jack the Ripper, it only makes sense that they would trend towards a profession like being a barber, because back then being a barber entailed lots of blood, kind of a very morbid profession back in the day. It's very much tamed now, but that's really, really interesting. And I didn't know any of that backstory behind Jack the Ripper. And now we know his identity too. That's crazy.
Yeah, wild times. So there should be some, hopefully, a resurgence of movies and shows and podcasts all about it, which I will be very excited to listen to and watch.
Yeah.
That's
Well,
good stuff. So we covered a lot of ground today. Any closing thoughts?
no closing thoughts from my end. Just a lot going on. It's nice because with the pace of Doge and executive orders and Trump presidency 2.0, there's always so much to cover. So yeah, we covered a lot of ground today, and I'm sure we will next week as well. But for those who liked what you heard here today, please like and subscribe. And I think that about closes us out. Yeah.
Yeah, follow us on X at Morgenstern NJ, at Sam Lyman 33. Thanks for joining us, and we'll be back next time on the Peer to Peer Policy Pod.